Chapter 21: Solid, Toxic, and Hazardous Waste. In the preceding chapters, we have talked a lot about air pollution, water pollution, and other sources of environmental degradation. This chapter deals specifically with waste. We will talk about solid waste in general, and then toxic and hazardous waste. You may be a little surprised with the definitions for those terms. Finally, we will revisit some of the federal legislation passed to address these issues. A pie chart of U.S. domestic waste. Domestic waste includes several categories ranging from food waste to textiles and other cloth items. The majority of this waste is thrown away and either buried in a landfill or incinerated. Only 25% is recycled. However, based on the classes of waste, much more than this could be recycled. The world generates a lot of waste. What do we do with it? The answer depends on where you live. In less developed countries, the waste is often thrown into open pits. While cheap and easy, these open dumps present many health and environmental problems. Because of this, they are illegal in the U.S. However, that doesn't mean open dumping doesn't occur. People in the U.S. like to change their own oil in their cars. However, over 52 million gallons of oil are dumped each year in the U.S. down storm sewers or poured on the ground. Additionally, rural areas are prone to illegal dumping of trash and other items. Another method of disposing of waste is to dump it in the ocean. The old saying is the solution to pollution is dilution. Of course, that isn't true, but it illustrates the attitude humans have towards the oceans. Because the open ocean isn't owned by anyone, it is hard to restrict dumping. However, much of the waste either washes up on shore or is consumed by animals, which often die. In the U.S., instead of using open dumps, we use sanitary landfills. These landfills are placed in specific areas to reduce the risk of groundwater contamination. The landfill is constructed by removing overburden, lining the pit with clay or some other liner, and then placing the trash on the liner. As the trash is being placed, it is covered by another layer of clay to seal it from the surface. This is done every day during operations. Once an area is full, the clay is covered over by the original overburden and replanted with grasses. Many have drainage systems that catch any fluids called leachate that drain from the landfill. This leachate is hauled away and treated to reduce its toxicity. Many of these landfills also place methane wells into the older sections and capture the methane produced underground when the waste decomposes. This methane is often burned to generate electricity. A photo of a sanitary landfill. Because of the issues associated with landfills, even sanitary landfills, it is becoming more difficult to find locations suitable for their placement. The end result is that many communities have passed restrictions on what can be dumped, mandating recycling and the removal of compostable waste from the waste stream. Additionally, it has caused the price to operate them to increase. Waste does not always have to be buried. It can also be burned, assuming the waste is of high quality energetically. Organic waste can be burned to produce heat, which in turn produces steam. This steam can then turn a turbine to produce electricity. To be effective, though, the waste needs to be separated prior to burning. This is usually accomplished at a materials recovery facility, MRF. However, many communities have failed to construct a waste incinerator, but are stopped over disagreement on where to place the MRF. To avoid sorting, some incinerators employ a mass burn, where everything including the kitchen sink is thrown into the incinerator. However, the heat generated by this type of incinerator is less than that from a refuse-derived incinerator. Also, the emissions from a refuse-derived incinerator are less. A photo of a mass burn incinerator. While incinerators show promise, they do have issues. First, They are expensive to build and operate, making trash expensive to dump. Second, depending on the waste burned, they can release high levels of toxins. This is why the waste stream needs to be sorted prior to burning. As we saw at the beginning of the chapter, much of the waste generated in the U.S. could be recycled. This recycling would reduce the waste stream and require less landfill space or incineration. Depending on the resource, recycling has been successful. However, there needs to be a market for the resource. These resources with value are those that are recycled at the highest rate. Recycling saves money. It does this in several ways. First, it reduces the amount of landfilling necessary. Second, for many resources, it is much more efficient and cheaper to recycle versus mining new product. For example, recycling aluminum uses 95% less energy than mining new bauxite ore to extract the aluminum. That saves money and is better for the environment. A bar graph of U.S. recycling rates. A graph of the disposal of municipal waste. One form of recycling not normally thought of is composting. Composting is simply the recycling of organic matter. This can be done in many ways. The most common is through open vessel composting. These can be simple or complex, but are what we typically think of when we compost lawn waste at our homes. Another method is in vessel composting. In this system, compost is digested within oxygen. These systems produce methane, which can be burned to produce energy. By composting, we can reduce the waste stream by at least 12%. While recycling has its benefits, from an environmental standpoint, it is better to reuse an object versus recycling. Reuse reduces the energy required to recycle and its associated environmental issues. Recycling and reusing help in reducing the waste stream. However, the most reduction occurs by not producing the waste to begin with. This can be accomplished in many ways. This includes simple things like reducing packaging. CDs used to come in giant boxes that included a lot of plastic and paper. Now, they are just big enough to contain the CD. Other options include using biodegradable packaging. However, the biggest and most successful way to reduce the waste stream is to reduce consumption. In other words, don't buy the CD. By doing this, you have not contributed to the impacts associated with the production of the CD, the packaging, or the shipping. Hazardous waste is waste that is toxic, carcinogenic, mutagenic, or teratogenic. They are also flammable, corrosive, and explosive. Interestingly enough, these things are not hazardous waste until they are set to be discarded. Before then, they are just product. Because hazardous waste is so dangerous to humans, they are regulated by federal regulation. This legislation includes the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, and the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, CERCLA, CERCLA. RCRA requires accounting of the hazardous substance from the point of generation to the grave, disposal. CERCLA gives the government the regulatory authority to fine industries who do not follow the guidelines of RCRA. It also provides for the cleanup of the most polluted sites, Superfund sites. CERCLA, 1980. Modified by Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, SARA, of 1984. Aimed at rapid containment, cleanup, or remediation of abandoned toxic waste sites. Establishes a community right to know. A toxic release inventory requires 20,000 manufacturing facilities to report annually on releases of more than 300 toxic materials. An illustration tracking cradle to grave of hazardous waste. One aspect of CERCLA that differs from many laws is that it does not require proof that the law was violated. It only requires that they played a part in the contamination. This could be the original company or a company that purchased the original company. As of now, there are approximately 36,000 Superfund sites. Of those, 1,680 have been placed on a priority list to clean up using monies gained by fines from RCRA and CERCLA violations. However, funding from the fines was never enough, and with congressional approval, the law was changed to use taxpayer monies to clean up the site instead of the polluter. This is significant because of the costs associated with the cleanup. This has been estimated at $1.7 trillion. The total cost for hazardous waste cleanup in the U.S. are estimated between $370 billion and $1.7 trillion of taxpayer money. Most sites are old industrial facilities and chemical manufacturing plants around the Great Lakes and Gulf Coast. Mining areas and old dumps are also prime sources of toxic waste. Studies of Superfund sites reveal minorities tend to be overrepresented in these neighborhoods. A map of hazardous waste sites in the United States.